it's such a pleasure to have you, Rachel. Honestly, it's fantastic to hear this amazing book, and we're going to talk about it in a second. But of course, I've got to give you a good introduction because that's what you deserve. So, without further ado, Rachel E. Gross is an award winning science journalist based in Brooklyn, New York, a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and digital science editor at the Smithsonian Magazine. She writes for BBC Future and is a columnist for their Missed Genius series, the New York Times as well, and Scientific American. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, National Geographic, Wired, New Scientist, Slate, Undark, and NPR, amongst lots and lots of others. So, Vagina Obscura, an anatomical voyage, tells the story of how early anatomists mapped our lady parts and how a new generation is wresting them back. So, of course, we're going to be discussing this very important book. So, why is there so much shame around our bodies?
Wow, great question. Um, I think that there's a very deep-rooted notion of shame attached to the female body specifically. So in the book, I go back all the way to Hippocrates, the OG Grecian medical doctor. We still have the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take today. And he actually named the genitals a word that means the shame parts. Uh, in this case, for both men and women. And over time, that shame became more attached to women and people with these body parts, vulvas, clitorises, uteruses. So every time an anatomist would name the clitoris or the vulva, they would insist on again naming it something like the part for which you should be ashamed. And even today in German, for instance, you have words like Schamlippen, the labia, which means shame lips. So I can say that it's very deeply rooted. Um, and, you could definitely say it has to do with religious attitudes, though I would say it's kind of more broad than that. It's like cultural attitudes about women needing to be modest and covered up and sexually chaste, and about medicine and broader society not wanting to see them as sexual beings. So a lot of the skewed science that we're going to talk about that really minimizes the clitoris and female sexuality and the outer female genitalia, which are very involved in pleasure and sexuality, um, has to do with this shying away from women as being sexual beings.
Interesting. So, do you think this is the reason why it's taken so long to investigate this? Is that it's seen as something we should be ashamed of and not seen in the forefront at all?
I think it's certainly a part of the puzzle. I think unfortunately there's this lethal intersection going on with a lot of what we think of as women's health care, but really is just the care for these body parts, the ovaries, uterus, vulva, clitoris, vagina. So yes, on the one hand, often even doctors are squeamish and don't want to get into their patients' sex lives. You'll notice that a gynecologist rarely asks you about your clitoris or your orgasms. Um, but also, things considered women's health issues are not seen as important.
Mm.
And it's kind of thought of as, well, it's not cancer, it won't kill you. So not only is it kind of like there's an ick issue or a shame thing, but also like it's not that important. It's just quality of life. It's not like you're going to die. So why should we put all these resources into investigating it? And a couple concrete examples of that would be vaginal
Mm.
infections. We've recently started looking at the vaginal microbiome, which is basically this protective ecosystem that helps defend us against
Mm.
invaders and infections and STIs, and is really important. And if we could find ways to strengthen it, we could prevent millions and millions of infections. But for a long time, medicine has seen these kind of infections as not that important and kind of icky because it's like bugs in the vagina.
Oh God, yeah, and tell me about it. I've seen all those adverts where they're just like, "Oh, make it fresh and make it clean," and it's ridiculous because they don't actually know what they're doing, and and this brings me on to obviously the important points, which is like, why is the clitoris so important?
Mhm. Um, Yeah, I mean, to me, it's very self-explanatory. The clitoris is the homologous organ to the male penis. It just doesn't have a urethra running through it and doesn't make sperm, but it is the organ of female sexual pleasure and orgasm, and it's crucial to our overall well-being. One thing that sexual health experts often say is sexual health is health, because they're constantly having to push against this narrative that sexual medicine isn't real medicine. It's kind of like soft or like frou-frou. Um, Actually, like, this has to do with all of our quality of life,
Mm.
and that's what makes life worth living. So it's really important to all of us who have a clitoris. Um, it also can be the center of many conditions, including skin
Mm.
conditions, vulvar cancers, and other things that you don't want. So it's just important to be aware of this part of your body and checking it, and hopefully have medicine checking it out from time to time.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I only really learned about like how important the clitoris was when I was in university and I saw the vagina monologues, and they said, "Oh, it's the equivalent of like the nerve endings, but it's got way more nerve endings than a penis head." And I was so shocked, and I was just like, "But we've never been told this." And and obviously with the clitoris, it's the idea of like female pleasure and things like that. But then obviously there are some really harmful practices such as like FGM. So how do we stop things like that as well from occurring?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, we actually don't know how the nerve endings in the clitoris compare to that of the penis. We actually just found out about 2
What?
months ago how many nerve endings the clitoris really has. Yes. So I think we'd been repeating these numbers again and again about something like 8,000 nerve endings, and this uh, surgeon who does gender affirmation surgeries and this vulvar specialist that I've talked to, they actually looked up that claim and found it came from a single study on cow
No.
clitorises in the 1970s. So, yeah, as much as we like to hold on to that, actually, we're still learning the very, very basics. So they went and counted for the very first time and found the number was something like
Oh my
10,280.
god.
Um, so just we are still learning, and I also find it helpful to, um kind of think twice before making these broad comparisons between the clitoris and the penis. I think it's really important that they come from the
Yes.
same tissues and they develop from all the same structures in embryos, but it hasn't been helpful throughout history to make comparisons because they end up um, kind of lowering the status of one and elevating the other. And that doesn't help any of us in our own personal experience. Um, as for practices like female genital cutting, um, I can't speak on what we can do to end these practices worldwide. I don't think I would be qualified. However, in my book, what I did find that was very surprising to me was that there was a long tradition of genital cutting in the West. So, in the 19th century and early 20th century, um, a procedure spread first in the UK and then in America called a clitoridectomy, and it was essentially it was an amputation of the top part of the clitoris, and it was used to combat like masturbation. So it was a time when there was this panic over masturbation. It was thought to be the most loathsome ulcer in society, and that it would cause madness and neurosis and hysteria. And so you might as well just remove this part and um, prevent the threat in the first place. So this is a tradition with long roots, and it does have to do with a fear of female sexuality when it's not directed towards procreation and
Mm.
heterosexual relations. There was also a fear of lesbianism at this time and just directing sexual energy towards anything besides making babies. Um, so I think we have to recognize that this is deep in
Mm.
so many cultures, and that if we don't dignify and truly care about people's sexual experience and their right to pleasure in their own bodies, which is really just a part of reproductive and sexual rights in general, part of the bodily autonomy movement, that nobody should do any procedure that removes a part of
Mm.
your body without your consent. And that includes infant and childhood procedures. Um, Generally, there's no reason that you should have healthy tissue
No.
removed for purely cosmetic or cultural reasons. So I guess what we do need is a more consistent and broad application of this respect for basic bodily autonomy.
Absolutely. And but the thing is that if scientists don't actually study the vagina, then how do we actually like enhance our knowledge or advance our knowledge in the area?
Yeah, well, I mean, things are changing. I definitely try to kind of push the story forward in my book and show some of the trailblazers today who are reimagining these organs, including the vagina. So, like, I think you have these dissenting voices. They're often women, scientists of color, LGBTQ researchers, and they're saying, hey, the vagina is not just a passive
Mm,
tube. Actually, it's this incredibly powerful muscular part of the body that's aligned with this ecosystem of important inhabitants, and we need to consider it as its own part of the body and not just a sheath for the
mhm.
penis. So, like, there's progress being made. In the long term, we do need actual investment and research dollars going into vulval and vaginal health. And at least here in the US, you see that very neglected historically. So it was only in 2014 that we got a branch of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, dedicated to vulvas and vaginas
Oh, cool.
when people are not pregnant or trying to get pregnant. So it was the first kind of recognition that you have these body parts your whole life. Again, whether or not you get pregnant during your life, they're important to your overall health and we need to take care of them.
Yeah, oh God, that's crazy. I'm like, do you think like getting more women into STEM or accepting more women just generally would help the field?
I think that is already happening, so we're seeing the effects of that, and again, I think that's only part of the puzzle. The problem is that everyone who is brought up in medicine or science today is indoctrinated in a way. There's a specific culture of medicine and science. Um, Part of it is masculinist and patriarchal. And, the same way that women perpetuate sexism in the workplace, you're still absorbing these same tenets about male and female bodies and about who gets to be a brilliant scientific mind. And you're still working within a structure that is
Mm.
hierarchical. So, yes, we need people with different points of view who are empowered to be asking new questions and have the authority to be able to ask them and follow up on them. But it's not enough to just have more women, just as it hasn't been enough to do these kind of very surface level diversity initiatives and get like a
Yeah.
token example of each group.
Yeah, that's so true. And but then, if that's the case, like, how do we change the view around vaginas generally?
Yeah, that's the question. Um, I mean, so I think, yeah, first you need to have alternate viewpoints so that because people don't we can't see what we can't imagine and we can't see what we aren't looking for. So we need people to lift up new hypotheses and theories. Um, and then the hard part is getting them taken seriously by the
Mm,
mainstream. So I think one really fruitful and interesting field, for me as I was writing this book, has been feminist philosophy of
mm,
science, and feminist science, and this is a branch that really acknowledges that science has been seen historically as this objective kind of view from nowhere, but in reality, it's been the view of powerful white European men, for much of time, and if you don't acknowledge that this is its own viewpoint and its own bias that needs to be uh, addressed, then there's no way to make science more
mm,
actually objective. So they kind of point out how these biases shape scientific knowledge and produce new hypotheses um, that counter these masculinist bias and offer like an alternative viewpoint. And so some of the fields they've been really instrumental in is they have countered the idea that the egg is like a
mhm,
passive damsel in distress and that the sperm is this daring prince or whatever that comes and penetrates it. And feminist scientists um, helped that field realize that there's all these active elements that the egg is doing to participate in this really mutualistic dance, like putting out certain chemicals and allowing and accepting one sperm and rejecting others. Um, Another one is, let me think for one second. Another one is uh, feminist scientists were really important in countering
Mm.
Bateman's theory, which basically extrapolated that because male fruit flies mated with a lot of females, that males of all species were going to be hornier and just indiscriminate maters, and the females would be chaste and passive and only want one partner. And so feminist scientists were able to be like, wow, this science is really bad and shoddy and makes a lot of assumptions and it just doesn't hold up. So we need an alternate hypothesis to
Mm.
explain this data. Um, so I think that's been really powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's two things that came from that. Well, first of all, I've got to ask, which is, how did you come about actually to write the book in the first place about vaginas, of course?
Yeah. So I've been a science writer for more than 10 years now, and I was a science editor at Smithsonian when I got the idea for this book. And I really liked writing about animal sexual behavior and reproductive science. And so I was really interested in writing about animal sex behavior and reproductive science. And I was also running this column by this incredible writer, Layla McNeil, called Unsung Women in the
Mm,
History of Science. And so what I was coming to realize through her profiles of women who kind of pressed up against the boundaries of science during their time was that one of the reasons that the female body has been um, so marginalized in history of science is that female voices have
mm,
been marginalized in the history of science. And so it was this intersection of what are the systemic ways that women and alternative voices are pushed out
mm.
of science, and what important knowledge about our bodies have we lost as a result. That was what I wanted to tackle in the form of sort of um, a wonder-filled adventure to the center of the female body.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, fascinating. Such a mind blowing and eye opening book and field, and I hope there's so much more that we get to learn and keep discovering, and hopefully your next book might explain some
It
more
might, it
of this.
might. Yeah, I mean, I really think that I just opened the door on a lot of these topics, and my hope is kind of that in a few years, this book will look kind of quaint and people will be like, "Why is that surprising? We know all of this already." Because I mean, what I hope is that this is a genre of book, like looking
Mm,
um at lesser known science of marginalized groups that is
mm.
beginning to blossom, and that we're going to get many, many more necessary voices into the conversation, more so than mine. So that's what I look forward to.
Oh yeah, me too, me too. And I still can't believe you said that word marginalized. It's absolutely like insane. Half the world.
Right,
It's
right,
yeah.
right. Like thinking like these are alternative voices in science or marginalized or minority. Like that's yeah, minorities not does not describe at least half the people on Earth. Um, and that's why I argue that this is not a book about women's health. This is about human health because you cannot call that like a small knowledge gap or something that only affects a minority group, even though that's bad enough. But basically, the fact that we lack knowledge about this part of the body is a huge hole in our understanding of the human body, period.
Yeah, 100%. Crazy. But Rachel, thank you so much for discussing this with me because it's so important. And I really, really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the book and I enjoyed the chat. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you so much. And thanks for having me and for your thoughtful questions. And looking forward to chatting again.